Forum Communications Company is proud to be a part of the Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org. Hey folks, before we get started, I just wanted to tell you, you can unlock unlimited access to political news, commentary, opinion, and a whole lot more at inforum.news/port for only 99 cents a month for your first 3 months. Hurry, get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk, and happy to be with you. I'll be honest, I was surprised by the primary turnout last night in some ways. Obviously, a lot of what was being litigated in this primary election was the divide in the North Dakota Republican Party. And, really, I think the turnout was a mixed bag. And I'm not sure that either side can really come out and declare an overall. If we're zooming out and we're just looking at the numbers made up in, the balance of power within the Republican caucus in the legislature, I'm not sure you could say a whole lot's changed. And I would argue even that with someone like Representative Rick Becker, not the chairman of the founder, I should say, of the Bosniak caucus, he's not going to be in the legislature again. I think you could even maybe argue that their influence is going to be on the wane, but still they got some very symbolic, very and I don't want to, when I'm calling them symbolic, I don't even want to make it seem like I'm minimizing them. They won some big ones last night. District 33, District 8 in particular, what we've been talking about for a long time. Some very interesting results, and we got a lot to talk about on the show. Later in the show, going to be joined by Pat Finken, who was he was very much part of the narrative. He was his Brighter Future Alliance was one of the groups sending out, some of the flyers that the people were objecting to. We're going to talk with him later in the show, but joining me for the first part, and along with my co-host Chad Oban, who's always with me on Wednesdays, is Jim Poolman, former insurance commissioner, former leader, vice chair of the North Dakota Republican Party, all-around political gadfly. Here he is. Mr. Poolman, how are you? Now he's frowning at being called a gadfly. He doesn't like that so much.
Oh, gadfly is fine. Whatever you want to call me.
Whatever.
Rob,
all right. Fine. That's fine. And then, of course, Chad, welcome.
So, Jim, I was thinking when Rob promotes this thing, he should just say Poolman and Oban so people think it's Nicole and Aaron. It'll probably bump up the listenership.
People will actually pay more to hear this.
Yeah, exactly.
Pay more than the $0 they're paying now. That would actually be nice if we could arrange that. Maybe next time I'll loop them in. What do you guys think? I have a column up this morning, and I'm leading up to it. I think in columns both in May and over the last weekend, right before the primary, I was expressing some skepticism about Governor Burgum's approach to this, which is to just basically dump mailers on everybody. I felt like he should have been out making an affirmative argument for what he's doing, and I think in a lot of the places where they lost, and again, you're talking District 33, Jessica Bell lost, and granted, Governor Burgum wasn't terribly involved in that race, but he was in the House race in that district, and one of his candidates won, one lost. District 8 was a total loss for them. That was tough all the way around. I don't want to say it would have changed the outcome because there's always a lot of factors that go into this, but my contention is that if the governor had taken a different tact, if in addition to doing the mailings and all the other stuff he did, he just went out and got on the stump and talked to people and explained to them what he was doing, the whole thing might have been better received, and maybe a couple of his candidates win. He wins a couple more of these races rather than losing. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I think that, one of my biggest takeaways last night is, Doug Burgum and the PAC got a really terrible return on their investment. I mean, when you talk about spending 1.6 million, and you mentioned the places where they spent.
By the way, it's 1 point. Not that this matters. It's 1.2 million. I got corrected. The way the Secretary of State's office does 48-hour reports, apparently they're cumulative and not individual transactions. So it's more in the ballpark of 1.2 million. But go ahead.
It could have been 1.1, and it's still not a very good return on investment.
Absolutely.
I mean, when you think about where he spent the most money was 8 and 33. I mean, that's where they're on the TV, and they won 1 of 6. I mean, they beat Jeff Delzer, which they're going to be pleased about. But they took a second shot at beating Jeff Magrum, and they lost again. I mean, you got to start to think, is Jeff Magrum unbeatable? Should Jeff Magrum be running for governor? Because he's the only one that keeps beating Doug Burgum. So one of my takeaways was the return on investment, that I think the Burgum camp needs to get maybe a little bit more sophisticated in what they're doing. But secondly, this might be a little bit personal for me, but public education had a really good night last night. The folks trying to take over school boards in Fargo and Grand Forks and Bismarck failed miserably. And so I think that's a good sign for the future in some of the fights that we're having.
Jim, your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to note here is not all districts are created equal. And there are different demographics in every one of these districts, different issues in every one of these districts. Let's take District 15, which was a bit of a sleeper up there in Dave Elke losing to Judy Estenson. And some of the feedback that I was getting, and of course, some of it's personal. Dave Elke's wife has been ill, and he's been distracted by some of that, and so it didn't necessarily work the way he probably should have to win that race. But that being said, what's I think important is this sort of the cookie cutter approach of doing these mailers and those types of things doesn't necessarily work in every district the way it works in some. For example, I was hearing that putting Dave Elke's picture alongside Donald Trump in Devil's Lake wouldn't necessarily have the appeal that it would in some other legislative districts, and so that might have worked against them. I give the governor credit. I want to say this right up front for playing, and he could have donated to other PACs and funneled a ton of money into different vehicles where he could have not had to put his name out there and taken the hits, the slings, the arrows, the credit, or whatever it might be, to step up and say, I'm trying to change the Republican Party into a governing Republican Party that I'd like to see. And so he gets some credit for that. Now, the mechanics of how that all worked, I go back to every district is not created equal. Every district has different issues. For example, in District 33, I firmly believe that Jessica Bell lost that race because of 1 vote. She'd still be in the state Senate for the next 4 years had she changed her vote on that transgender piece of legislation, because you have a lot of culture warriors out in District 33 who were not pleased about that particular vote. That does not play in other districts. Everything is different, and the issues are different per district.
I think we're all saying variations on the same theme, which is that if and again, looking at this through the lens in this sort of divide in the Republican Party between culture warrior populists and maybe more traditional Republicans, that I think Governor more sophisticated. I think, to use Chad's words, you got to be more sophisticated. And again, I maintain at the end of the day, you still have to talk to the voters. And I think that was one. I think what Magrum and obviously Rick Becker and some of that, what they were able to do when they held that press conference in Bismarck was in a lot of ways neutralize those mailers, at least in some instances. Now, I think you're right, Jim. You look at District 35, where Sean Cleary won decisively over Ryan Eckroth. Obviously, there weren't any problems there, but in District 8, there were. And I mean, at one point, you even had like they had a mail carrier who was on Facebook, complaining about the mailers. They really. I wrote in my column that if you're making a bully like Jeff Magrum look sympathetic, you're doing it wrong. And they kind of did. They dumped money in. They made him look like the underdog. And I think voters responded to that, which speaks, I think, to Chad's point. You got to be more sophisticated about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that this wasn't an election just about Doug Burgum or just about Brighter Futures Fund. I mean, you think about like Representative Schmidt down in 31.
Yeah,
lost. I mean, that wasn't even on my radar that was a competitive race.
Yeah, he lost. And by the way, a big loss. That's a big loss for Minot. I'm hearing from all the Minot people right now Jim Schmidt was very instrumental in fighting for flood control for us, even though he's far from he doesn't represent a district anywhere near us. That was a big loss for Minot, and I suspect a lot of other communities around the state.
Well, and Rob, I would also suggest
and beaten by a high schooler, by the way.
Yeah. So, and I think that's, Rob, you said at the outset that it likely won't change things very much. There are 4 like young active Republicans that were elected last night. Essentially, when you talk about Brandon Pritchard, you talk about Heilman up in the Poolman district, District 7. You talk about Hawley in 33, and then Christensen in 24. I mean, those sort of young, sort of rabid's maybe not the right word, but maybe a little bit more fringy Trumpian candidates, I think are going to change the tone in the House. I think what's happening around here, the Sean Cleary race, right? He would have won 60-40 without Burgum, without Brighter Futures PAC, without all that kind of stuff. I mean, I was on their mailing list, and I didn't get anything from Burgum until the last week. And I think Sean was in pretty good shape. But to Jim's point, District 35 is different than so many of these other rural districts. This is a company town, right? We're connected to the state government and all that kind of thing. So maybe we're more open to that. Some of the rural areas are just mad at everybody. And so having the governor come in and spend all this money doesn't land very well. And I also agree with Jim's point that the governor should do this, right? I mean, if this is the way he wants the party to go, he should do it.
I agree with that. I think the governor should do it. I just think he should do it differently. Does that make sense, Jim?
Yeah, I think it goes back to campaign mechanics. And again, I give the governor credit for stepping in and putting his money where his mouth is. And forcing legislators to say, okay, you voted no on 40 of 49 appropriations bills. Why? And you don't get a pass for that. Then explain your votes. And some people don't like to have to explain that kind of thing. But I do agree with you that in some particular cases, for example, Magram, he may have successfully made himself out to be a martyr, and that's unfortunate. But again, every district is different. One of the things that's going to be interesting to see is if the behavior in these legislative caucuses changes based on the campaigns that were run in primaries. Will it shift to the right to make sure that they don't have those types of primaries that we just had, or will they not want to vote no on so many of these budgets because they're going to have to explain it without offering amendments or any changes to those budgets? It'll be interesting to watch to see if behavior changes because of what we just saw last night.
Hey, Jim, can I ask you a quick question? Do you think the incumbents losing last night will have an effect on who gets elected majority leader? I mean, I think without having Bell there and Elke there and potentially a contested race on the Senate side, do you think that that's going to matter?
I think that there's a lot of vote counting going on today, based on where the philosophies line up with potential leadership candidates, and yes, I do believe that that'll make a big difference.
Well, and there may be some calculation
who runs and how they run.
Well, I mean, if somebody wanting to be a majority leader of the House, for instance, is going to have to start thinking about the people in their caucus that they're going to have to up here in Minot. In District 3, which, by the way, is still unsettled, and I think we're in for a little bit of a mess in District 3 because I've had, first of all, one vote separate. Lori Van Winkle, obviously was the top vote getter in the House race. Senate race on the Republican side was uncontested. Jeff Hoverson and Roscoe Striley separated by one vote. But there's some weird stuff going on. Like if you were watching the totals come in, it said, 4 of 4 precincts partially reporting. And then all of a sudden, like 8 votes got added, and then it was 4 of 4 completely reporting, and Striley went from 1 up to 1 down. And somebody was telling me that they think, and the recount will catch this, but what they think is that they may have put some test votes in the system and didn't clear them out, and that has actually happened in previous cycles. But also, there's still votes to be counted that were in the mail, that were postmarked, that haven't been put in the totals yet. So who knows where that one's going to be. But my point is, if you're a majority leader, you're going to have to be in charge of this caucus. So let's say in District 3, the delegation is Jeff Overson and Lori Van Winkle. Well, Lori Van Winkle was just at on Monday, was at a forum, and her big selling point to the people was, let's impeach Doug Burgum, right? let's impeach Doug Burgum. That was her big push. And also let's abolish property taxes. And then somebody asked, Striley, made the point, well, if we abolish property taxes, we're going to have to increase state spending, because how do you replace that revenue? You're talking about $2.4 billion or whatever it is. That money's got to come from somewhere. Are you going to create a new tax? Are you going to raise taxes? And also, if the state's going to do it, the state's going to have to replace the funding, unless we're going to close schools or fire departments or something. So her thing was, well, there's smart people who will figure that out. I guess completely losing sight of the fact that the legislature is supposed to be the smart people who figure that out. Anyway, if people like that are now in the House caucus, whoever's majority leader is going to have to deal with them. So that would go into the calculation for people. Do you want to be majority leader over this?
And I think that, we've had lots of conversations about how governing is hard. And so it's easy to be in the Bastiat caucus. It's easy sometimes to be a Democrat and just sort of complain about things, but actually trying to do things is much more difficult. And so I think some of these folks coming in who maybe said one thing on the trail, as you know, I don't believe one state legislator is going to solve inflation, no matter what the TV commercials have been saying. And based on the results last night, I guess people in District 8 don't care that Representative Naring was getting up every day to fight Biden's inflation, based on the results.
In his duck hunting outfit, right?
Yeah. So, again, I think that the lack of sort of, these districts are personal. They're people know the people they're running for. And so just to have cookie cutter approaches sending into these districts doesn't work. I also think it sounds like the polling was off. I mean, I know that I talked to a lot of people who said Elke's fine, Bell's fine. You go down the list of all these sort of normal folks that the Burgum polling showed were in good shape. It's hard to poll a legislative district. I mean, to get a sample that's worth a damn. So I guess lesson learned next primary, maybe not believe the polling, but it's an interesting night, and I think a mixed bag across the board.
Rob, let me just go back to your question and ask you or answer this way. I think that there are probably going to be declared candidates, fully declared candidates for majority leader in both the House and the Senate here very shortly, probably this week. And they've been talking to incumbents already. And so here's what I think is going to happen. And what I think is beneficial for caucuses and leadership to have a primary like you had last night and some changeover is that it forces leadership, or those that are going to be in leadership, to bring those new members into the fold and make them feel like they are part of the process. And what I think has happened in the past in respective caucuses is that some people, since the Republican caucuses are so big and Democrats don't matter, and I don't mean that, I mean, you know how I mean that politically, is that it's the same leadership structure that's brought into the fold, and new members are sort of left out of conversations and they need to be brought in. This leadership election will force those people to be brought in and make them feel much more part of the team than they had been before, which could, I say in quotation marks, build a better team than it would be if you didn't have those leadership elections out there and it was just presumptive of who was going to lead the caucuses.
I think there's a potential, especially when you're looking, somebody like Jeff Mangrum, I think is just he's going to be difficult to deal with. And Jeff Hoverson, if he's back, is going to be difficult to deal with. You go down, some of these younger people that were elected, there may be some room there to bring them into the fold and say, listen, this is how you govern. This is what our priorities have to be. You have real people and real businesses in your district for whom your decisions in the legislature are hugely consequential. So, there may be some opportunities in that. Let's talk turnout, by the way. I went back and I looked at primary election turnouts going back to 2000. Before that, we don't really have the turnout number, or at least not readily accessible, that I could get this morning. This was the lowest since 2000, more than 20 years. The next lowest, I think, was looks like 2014. We were at 17.18. We were at 15.71% turnout. Now, obviously, that's going to change a little bit. There's still some votes out there to count, but that was a low number. Do you think that played into it? What are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely think it played into it, and I think that folks that are angry, folks that are activists, folks that are have been thoroughly involved in campaigns got out to vote, and the average voter that may not be entrenched in politics probably stayed home, and they've got other things going on a beautiful summer day where they're taking their kids to sports or whatever it might be. And so I think that I'll take Burleigh County, for example, in our legislative district in 7, it was abysmal. And I will tell you that, for example, in the District 8 race, where you have a brand new constructed district, Dave Naring was looking for a blockbuster turnout in Burleigh County to help him close a gap with Jeff Magrum. Well, that didn't happen. And in fact, in a pretty good chunk of Burleigh County, Jeff Magrum won there. And that was a big difference in the Naring Magrum race.
Well, just to put an exclamation mark on the turnout, in Minot, we elected a new mayor, and total votes 4,558 votes in a city with, I don't know what the eligible voter count is. It's got to be close to 40,000, and 4,558 people voted for mayor in a 3-way race. I mean, that's bad.
But I think this conversation sort of takes us back to the mechanics of these independent expenditure groups, right? I mean, if you're looking at spending $1 million on mail, maybe you should have been spending that in the field, turning out people to vote. Because when you're winning these primaries, I mean, I think, Jim, did the House candidates in your district get about 1,000 votes each? I mean, you start thinking about, you turn out 100 new voters by knocking on their doors or, getting them to the polls. It's a better use of money than sending out another mail piece saying that somebody's terrible. So I think that mechanically, I agree. And the other thing at play, I know Democrats only make up about 20% of the state, but what the hell did a Democrat have to go and vote for other than local elections, or to cross over like many of us did?
You look at like District 8 where Magrum, in the Senate race, Magrum won decisively, but that was still, the separation was less than 400 votes. You look at like, some of these other districts. I mean, to Chad's point, it doesn't take a lot of turnout to really swing some of these races.
I'll give you an example, Rob. Watching the Jessica Bell, Keith Boehm race last night in 33, Boehm was ahead because, Morton County and a couple of those, other spots that were likely to be good for Boehm came in, and it was like this wide percentage spread, but that was like 25 points, but yet it was only like 300 or 400 votes, and so that's why the gap closed when Mercer County came in, because there's a bunch of votes there from Mercer, who by the way vote by mail primarily, and so which made it a lot easier for them. But the low voter turnout, as just to put an exclamation point on one that was just made, is that when you can close a gap of 200 votes, it's not that hard to do with a turnout operation. I also would say this, and I haven't thought about this, but I've heard it from a couple of people in districts where there was a ton of mail or some negativity or back and forth. Some people were maybe just turned off by that and chose not to go to the polls on a nice summer day.
I think that's a fair point. There is I mean, it's really easy to vote in North Dakota, right? I mean, I don't think that's the problem. You don't have to register before the primary. You just got to make sure you got your address straight on your ID, and you're good to go. So that's gonna be very, very interesting to watch. But I think you're right. I mean, it could have been just that people were turned off. The other thing too, when we're doing these election analysis, I think it's always an exercise in justifying why you lost without having to reconcile the fact that maybe you just weren't what voters wanted. And I think that's a part of this too. For instance, we were talking about District 33, and Jim, you said that Jessica Bell is probably still going to be in the state Senate, but for that vote on regulating, the participation of transgender students in high school sports. She voted to sustain Governor Burgum's veto of that. And I thought Governor Burgum's veto was appropriate for that bill. I didn't like that bill, but clearly a lot of people out there thought that bill was so important that they voted out a person who saved the North Dakota's largest coal-fired power plant in the heart of coal country. if that coal plant goes away, entire communities in District 33 dry up and drift away. But what was important was the vote. I think that gets back to maybe messaging and maybe trying to convince voters that there are bigger priorities than that. But if voters, if that's the priorities voters have, then I don't know what you do about that.
Yeah, they have to be open to it. I mean, when we had Jessica on this podcast and she talked about the transgender vote, and she talked about the fact that it's words on a piece of paper that matter. And here's why she voted the way she did. It's impossible when the other side is saying trans people are going to be in your bathrooms and all those other things. I will say one thing about many of the incumbents, not many, but certainly Jessica, she left it on the field. Right. I mean, so many of these candidates did everything they could. And sometimes it's just the voters aren't with you. So I think Jessica should be happy this morning. I think in probably a week or so, she'll probably be pretty happy that she's not going back to Bismarck in January when she comes to terms with that. But, when you leave it all on the field and the voters just aren't with you, at least you can sleep at night. I mean, and if she lost because of the transgender vote, it was the right vote. And sometimes you just have to vote the right way. And if the voters are going to focus on things that don't matter as much as saving a coal plant, saving the whole economy of the district, I don't know what you do, man.
Well, obviously that one is personal to me, we lost an incredibly effective legislator last night. And
Right.
Let me give you another example. Not just coal and the economic engine of her district, but she also, if you remember, crafted the compromise on the fly to save the COVID mandate bill that so many of those folks who are anti-COVID, anti-mandate, anti all of that were wishing to pass, that would not have passed had she not stepped forward and crafted a very quick compromise on the fly to save that bill generally, to bridge the gap between those that didn't want to vote for those types of things and those that wanted to get rid of any sort of ability to mandate anything. She did it because she's an effective legislator, and that is lost on people. And that's why it's important to look at other issues, not just single issues. But again, that's me. By the way, I know because I've talked to her. She called and congratulated her opponent this morning because she's a classy person, and I'm proud of her for that. And I agree with you that after the sting of a loss wears away, she's going to be just fine.
Yeah, I tell you, when you lose, and I think we've all been on the losing end of arguments sometimes, and it hurts, and it's hard to be magnanimous. In 2012, I remember the Senate race in 2012 and what a hard fought race that was. And everybody knows how I feel about Heidi Heitkamp and her leadership style for our state. But when she won, I mean, the first thing I did is congrats, you won. I think we have enough of this. Well, and it's one thing, you look at District 3 where it's separated by one vote. I mean, obviously you gotta investigate that and interrogate those results and make sure they're reflective of the actual totals. But and somewhere we need more of that. To Jim's point, we need more of the integrity of just admitting, you know what, I lost this one, I'll get you next time.
I totally agree with that. But back to the point of laying it all out on the field, District 3 is another one. Roscoe Striley worked his tail off, put together a plan, a serious, you can paint Roscoe however you want to, but this guy put together an actual, first of all, a campaign plan, but an issue plan, and brought forward a serious plan on an issue. We didn't hear much of any of that throughout the entire campaign about ideas on how to govern, ideas on how to make things better. And, he drove the entire conversation in the last 3 weeks of that campaign in District 3. And it became about a serious issue about property taxes and how are you lowering them and what is the state going to do about them. And I love the fact that win or lose, he drove the conversation. There needs to be a hell of a lot more of that in campaigns rather than just talking about platitudes or, culture warrior issues.
Yeah, Jim, I could not agree with you more on Roscoe. I mean, when he was on the podcast, we had like a real conversation, and he was talking about why 50% versus elimination. And then I drove into Minot like a week later, and the electronic billboards is Roscoe 50% reduction in property tax. And then Lori Van Winkle, let's get rid of all property taxes. And to Rob's point, with no thought that goes into how do you do that? I mean, governing is really hard.
How do you do that without hurting the people, right?
So I know we only have 3 minutes left, but were you guys surprised by the margin in the Fargo mayor's race? I mean, I thought it would be, I'm not surprised by the result. I'm surprised by the margin. I mean, Shannon Rose Jones only getting 15% of the vote, I think is where it ended up.
And remember that one is approval voting. So it's a little not apples to apples with some of the other numbers we're talking about, but,
I'm not smart enough to figure out that entire approval voting system. I prefer to pick one candidate and be done. So I don't know exactly how that rolls out, but I do believe that this whole issue of the townhomes in Fargo and managing a conflict of interest was a lot. That is an easy concept for people to understand and to get and to process. And I think that if you're explaining that and trying to explain it away, you're having a very tough time.
I think I think she also made a mistake when she didn't have a plan in place for how she'd handle her legislative seat. I had her on Monday right before the election, and I asked her that question, and she basically said, I'll figure it out if I win. I think you need a decisive answer for voters on something like that. That's the sort of thing that turns people's heads. Well, Jim, we've used up all our time with you. We're going to move on and talk with Pat Finken here in a moment, but thanks for your time.
Thanks, thank you, guys. Great to be with you. Bye-bye.
Well, Ed, we just finished up our conversation with Jim Poolman. It was a very consequential primary night. Now, to finish out the show, we're going to have an interview with Pat Finken, who was one. He was directly involved in these races. His Brighter Future Alliance, right? Is that the right? Is it the Brighter Future Fund, Brighter Future Alliance? What is it?
Brighter Future Alliance.
Brighter Future Alliance was one of the groups running flyer. Governor Burgum's efforts got the most headlines, but certainly the Brighter Future Alliance, was sending out mailers as well. Pat, we've been talking about a lot of it. It was a low turnout night. I went back and understanding there's still ballots out there to count, but as it stood as of this morning, lowest turnout for a June primary going back to 2000. So very low turnout. Let's start here. What's your headline coming out of last night?
You'll have to forgive me. My dog is in the background. He's heard something in the yard. So this is what happens when you work these days. Well, I think the headline is that it's a mixed bag. Obviously, Brighter Future had a mixed bag. We had some wins and we had some losses. I think there were places where the outside money played, and I think there are some races that there were other factors involved. I think it's a mixed bag. I think all in all, the Bastiat's probably, as you pointed out in your column, broke even or maybe even gained a couple, although we won't know that till the fall because some of those gains are in districts that we might not carry in the fall. So, like I said, it's a mixed bag at this point.
I just have to say before we get started, when Pat got on, he said, who would have thought that Chad Oban and Pat Finken would be on a podcast together? And Pat, I want to remind you that when Aaron and I adopted our son, the first gift we got was from Pat Finken because you were working with Aaron on some tobacco stuff. So if you ever wondered if North Dakota was a small place, I think that's a perfect example of and how nice people are in North Dakota.
Well, your wife is one of the truly nice people. I've always really liked her. I always appreciated her, and quite frankly, respected. That didn't mean we always were on the same side of the data, but when it comes down to the elections are for choosing. After that, it's about working together, and your wife has always been somebody that you could work with, and so by the way, you can tell her congratulations from me on her new gig. So now, Chad, you on the other hand,
no. I often tell people if they know Aaron before they meet me, they're often very, very disappointed when they meet me. They have too high of expectations.
Well, so Pat, it's a charitable soul, Chad. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you describing last night as a mixed bag on the legislative races is exactly the way I would describe it. Looking at the races you guys competed in, it looks like you were maybe under 50%, Hall of Fame if you're a baseball player. But can you talk a little bit about some of the races that that maybe the normal Republicans were unsuccessful in some of the factors that you saw at play across the state?
Well, I always like to start with the good news. The good news is I think we made a rather substantial impact in 28 and 35. I think those are two districts. And if Roscoe prevails in 3, that'll be another one. Because obviously that compared to last election, the incumbent in that district really had a considerable drop off. It's just that was there enough there to make up with Roscoe? And that'll be decided in the coming days. But yeah, I mean, those 3 are the ones where I thought we made an impact. There are some that we didn't, and I would point to not the legislative race, but I think the money we spent in Fargo on the city commission race probably worked against us in that because of all the attention it got. And everyone's hypersensitive. Now, groups like Brighter Future always get attention, right? But because of what the governor's doing, there's a heightened awareness of what's going on there. And I think that plays out. But one place where I think that didn't play out as much as it gets the attention is in 33. You asked me the question, what did I think were some of the factors? 33 is one of those. Anna Novak won, obviously supported by the governor. We didn't have a dog in that fight, but obviously it made a difference because Jeff Delzer lost as well. Beyond that, though, Jessica Bell, I think that's going to come down. And while there's always a lot of factors in why people win or lose, I think if you look at 33, the biggest factor is not going to be money, even though that did play, the money she raised, the money everybody else put into it. But the biggest issue is she voted against the veto override on the transgender bill. And at the end of the day, that mobilized that evangelical Christian right in that district, which is a powerful force. And even though she's long been strongly pro-life, all those things, that one vote, if I had to pick one thing in 33 that made a difference there, that's the vote. That's what got Keith Boehm into the race, actually.
We talked, in fact, we all came to that conclusion in the first part of the podcast that vote was probably, to the extent that any one variable can be the variable, that was probably it for that race. My argument this morning, Pat, is I'm feeling like, because obviously there's a divide, we've been talking about it for so long, there's a divide in the Republican Party, and it's making some people, like you talk about this podcast where you and Chad are talking together, it's making some people who spend most of their time disagreeing with one another on policy kind of come together in favor of serious policy makers, right? People who are going to engage in the debate in good faith, who are going to have serious proposals, who understand how the government works. And I think that's what a lot of us have been fighting for, is not everybody who elects has to agree with me, but everybody has to take this job seriously. And so if we're going to continue that debate going forward, I think some of the electioneering stuff that's going on, I use it, that sounds kind of like a pejorative term, but you know what I mean? Some of the campaign stuff that's going on has to get more sophisticated. For instance, my argument this morning in my column was that Governor Burgum would have been a lot more effective if he had made the affirmative case for what he's doing. If he had come out, because I think that's what Magrum and them, they held the press conference, they were talking to people about it, and they turned the tables on it. And on the other side was really nobody, right? I mean, the candidates were left to explain it, but the candidates don't have anything to do with it, right? It's independent spending. So, the candidates are kind of forced trying to make the governor's case for him. I thought the governor should have made his case. Get on the stump, get behind the bully pulpit, do whatever you need to do to explain to the people what you're doing. Like, do the voters the courtesy of explaining to them why you're doing what you're doing. I think that was a big mistake he made.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree with that they had to do a better job of that. But again, talking about multiple influences, that 8's a good example of that. One is if there was an example of the Bastiat, Jared Hendricks machine kicking into high gear, that's the district, right? I mean, Magrum's power base has always been Emmons County, but they worked very hard in Burley and McLean to shore up their weaknesses there, and they turned their voters out in a large turnout. And that was a well-run, well-oiled machine. And while they did get a lot of press and they were effective in neutralizing some of the outside influences, including us, the bottom line is that I would tell you that the organization there and the fact that he appeals to that crowd, and I would argue that he swept his popularity and his machine is what swept Pritchard and to a lesser degree Sue Ann Olson, but certainly contributed to both of them winning.
They rode his coattails.
Yeah, no question. I left to their own device, I still think Sue Ann Olson, because I think she's going to be a quality legislator. I actually have known her a long time. I think she's going to be a good, solid, conservative legislator, but certainly swept Brandon Pritchard in behind him.
So, Pat, one of the things we talked about in the first half hour was sort of the tactics that are used by outside money. And I think, you've been involved in this for a long time, and, field can help at the margins. And with these low turnout elections, you're sort of in the margins to start out with, right? I mean, even if you're winning 60-40, it's a couple hundred votes. Do you think that, Brighter Futures and some other, maybe the Burgum camp will look at tactics a little bit differently, that maybe it's not paid media, but instead investing in field and turning out? I mean, in so many of these races, if you do turnout and you get another 100 votes, 150 votes, you're winning a lot of these races. And so, $1.2 million, I don't know how much you guys spent. Actually, I could, but I don't. Do you think that using maybe some different tactics to turn out, and maybe you did that and I just don't know it?
Well, the reality is that I think you're onto something there, but keep in mind that voter turnout, GOTV, as you have worked campaigns, still requires that voters have made a decision. Because the GOTV efforts unto themselves aren't going to get people to vote one way or the other. So you still have to do the communications piece that causes them to want to vote one way or the other. But then, as you can see, especially places where, like 3 is a good example of that. I don't think any turnout effort in 8 would have made a difference, or 33. But certainly in some parts of the state, that would have made a difference. And 3 is the poster child for that, is that having a robust voter ID and turnout, once people have taken a stand, and then driving your people to the polls. That's essentially what we did with Measure 5, the outdoor heritage measure, right? We convinced people that it was a bad deal, but then we also had a very strong get out the vote. Now, Brighter Future did engage in a very low yield kind of effort in that regard in this last effort, but I think going forward, you'll see us add that to the portfolio of what we're doing. And actually it fits in with, because we're talking a lot about elections today, but that's a very small piece of what Brighter Future does. Brighter Future is largely issue driven. We support energy development, pipelines, those kinds of things, a lot of policy kind of work, but we're also into one of our efforts right now is identifying energy voters and making sure that they're well informed and then show up. So I would agree wholeheartedly with you that is a big piece of it. Going forward is that piece added to what happened, because unto itself, get out the vote's not going to get the job done. You still got to convince the people to pick one over the other. And that includes, by the way, both selling yourself, but also doing what we did in some districts, which is also making sure that people are well aware of your opponent, because they're not going to tell you that, right? And I get people get really uncomfortable when we talk about what a lot of people refer to as negative advertising or negative campaigning. But the truth is, campaigns have a responsibility, whether it's them themselves or outside groups like us, to educate voters to the good and the bad, right? And if you don't do that, you don't win. But also, voters deserve to know. Good example of that is District 35. A get out the vote effort there wouldn't have changed anything if we hadn't educated people to Ryan Eckroth's past problems. And while Rob really did a good job of that penetration level in a city like Bismarck is very small. And the local newspaper was a passing shot. If we hadn't done that, voter turnout wouldn't have helped at all, because people wouldn't have had the information they needed to make the right decision. And
it's not right. And it's not my job to message for or against any candidate. Anybody out there who's got something negative in their resume that I think is relevant to voters, I'm going to write about it. I don't care who the candidate is.
Right.
I think this is all making the point we've been making all show, which is that I think things just got to get more sophisticated. And I do think, and I think this is probably true in North Dakota, maybe even more so than a lot of other parts of the country, is that North Dakota voters need to feel spoken to, right? They need to feel like there's a personal connection and you're communicating with them. And that was my big criticism of Governor Burgum's efforts specifically, is because it was so what's the word I'm looking for? Indiscriminate. Like, it was just so, like, just bales and bales of mailers raining down on people. I think that backfires because that feels cynical, right? It feels impersonal. Whereas if he had gone out and he makes, maybe he still does the mailers, but he also, drives up to District 8 and gets behind a podium with the candidates and say, listen, this is why I support these people. And this is why I don't think that this slate of candidates would make good policymakers. That still matters. You still have to make an affirmative argument.
And I agree. And in fact, I would argue that a lot of the races that he engaged in didn't really have anything to do with power mongering or any of that thing, except for the Jeff Delzer one, right? That was personal. I believe that was personal.
That was personal.
But beyond that, I think it was about having, it was a matter of choosing people who could be good policymakers and people that have been obstructionists in the past. And this gets to my own and Brighter Futures operation to a large degree. We support conservatives. We helped a lot of conservatives in this election, in addition to the people we opposed. But it's as you and I have talked before, Rob, it's about getting good people into office and people that make a difference. And it's not just somebody who shows up and votes no every time, but it's actually somebody that then makes an effort to affect change, whether it's to suggest amendments or an alternative budget or whatever the message, whatever it is, someone who elect people that not only take a position and grandstand on it, but actually attempt to make a difference. Because you can't just sit there and slap each other on the back and vote no and think you've accomplished it.
Pat, it's really interesting when I looked at your guys' funding, and it's very similar to the races where North Dakota United, where I work, spent money. I mean, we spent money on Herberly. We spent money on many of the same places because of the goal that you just laid out. We want serious policymakers, even if we don't agree with people, even the majority of the time. And I want to go back to one of Rob's points earlier about sort of the meeting people face to face. I think in my district 35, I think the work that was done by the Cleary campaign, first to sort of introduce himself, but then the independent groups coming in afterwards with the Eckroth piece, in addition to Sean working his tail off. I mean, Sean was out knocking doors. He came to our door. We had a nice conversation. And I think that it's good when candidates go out and meet people. It's good politics, but it also makes really, really good governing. And if you talk to Sean Cleary, he'll tell you the best part of this campaign was going out and talking to people. That's the best part of it. So I want to
be honest, historically, door to door and yard signs are how you win elections. It's only in those situations where there's the rest of the story.
Right.
Groups like mine get involved.
What I think also in 35, it's interesting, Eckroth had the same issues as Gary Emeneth did 4 years ago. And when Erin pointed out that stuff, she got the same blowback that you guys got about, the negative campaigning. I want to shift away from legislative. When you guys did the pepcorn stuff in Fargo, I talked to a lot of people who are like, what's the goal here? Is the goal to help Shannon? Is the goal to help Al Carlson? What's the play here? What's the chess that Pat Finken is doing? Can you tell us, was it just to not elect pepcorn, or was there something else at play?
No, there wasn't anything else in play. What it is I have spent the better part of 35 years electing Republican legislators. And, obviously I don't support them all because, of course, just look at what I've engaged in and what my organization has engaged in the last 30 days. But I don't appreciate when somebody takes a shot at one of our good, solid Republican legislators. And that's all it was, and quite frankly, while I would have liked to have seen Pepcorn lose, it's not essential to achieving my goal there. It's about making people understand that you don't take on good legislators. And Jim Rohrs is a good legislator. And that whole dust up is what prompted my group and my board to engage in that race. It's just, that's just not acceptable.
How much of, because obviously Pepcorn won. And one of my arguments in that is I am not going to be for anyone who can't control themselves in public, right? Who's a bully. I want them out. Which is a lot of like my feelings about people like Jeff Magrum. I don't think it has a place. I want serious, good-hearted people who are trying to serve the public. But what if the voters want something else? And I think maybe this speaks to the larger issue of it's got to be more than just mailers. It's got to even be more than just get out the vote. There's like a philosophical argument here that has to be won, because right now the voters of District 3 seem to care a hell of a lot more about a single vote about transgender students than they do about the economic future of their communities, right? I mean, that's the way they voted. I mean, it seems like that's their priorities. And those priorities seem completely upside down to me, and I don't know how to convince voters you need better priorities. I think that's a debate we're having nationally, where the priorities of voters sometimes who are voting for some of these candidates nationally are very strange, and it's happening locally.
Yeah, and I think you meant 33, not 3, but
33. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think you were talking about 33, but the reality is that this isn't. You mentioned before that North Dakota is a little different. I don't believe we're any different at all. In fact, if you look at more conservative, the red states, this is going on. The battle has really been between and nationally. The left and the right have their own crazies, right? And in the liberal states, the crazy like Minnesota, their politics is being largely dominated by their extreme left. Just like here, the rising right is having some considerable impact. Now, is it dominant? No, because you look at what happened statewide, it's still 20 to 25%, right? That's kind of, if you look back over the last decade, that group has gotten somewhere in 20 to 25% of the vote in primaries against Jack Dalrymple, and you just go down the list.
Oh, John Hoeven last night. Right. Riley Kuntz got, 22% of the vote against John Hoeven.
Right, and so that's existed for some time, both in convention, but also in the primaries. Different story when you get to the broader general election, and that goes back to turnout. You asked the question. I think you're right. We got to have a serious discussion. Get back to how to are voters voting for the wrong reasons? Well, that's up to them, and they shape our government, right? But part of what isn't happening now is that it's not truly representative of the Republican Party when you have 1,000 people show up in District 3. That is, I mean, those environments are what allow some of the more extreme candidates in extreme positions to take hold and be successful, just like in district conventions. That smaller universe allows those people to have a louder voice. The secret in primaries and in generals is to make sure that you have turnout to really be able to represent what's going on. Now, that's not to say that stuff, Trump and what's going on around Trump is broader than that 20-21%, right? That's going on everywhere. Just like the transgender thing worked at 33. They didn't have a great turnout, but they still had one of the better turnouts in the state. So yes, there are going to be social issues that play out. And that happened in North Dakota long before. Abortion's a good example of that. But there are going to be smaller enclaves where the more interesting and maybe extreme visions get some traction because of turnout.
So, Pat, the first time I was on a podcast with Rob, we were talking about the Bastiats, and the first thing I said to him was, don't you sort of, aren't you somewhat to blame for this? Because you were part of the Tea Party, and sort of that's where I sort of saw this, but you answered it well, Rob, and it was a good conversation. I'm going to throw something at you right now, Pat. One of the things that Rob and I talk about this is the ability to have conversations about big, in-depth sort of issues. And in making our campaigns about more than just, cookie cutter, sort of the other guy's bad. Some of the mail pieces I saw, which I thought were brilliant as a political standpoint, but like having Magrum with the thinker hat on and essentially like saying he's not very smart is the way that I interpreted that. Do those things further the dialogue we're trying to have, or is it just a win at all costs and great, you won the election, but now we're just going to, be terrible to each other during the session? Do you reflect on that? I think we all probably in the last few years have, but what's your take on that?
Well, number one is that, you're not going to have that dialogue in that constrained time frame that happens around elections. That's the time that you have to make the case based on what is, not what should be. And that's why we focused, even though we had some clever ways of communicating it, everything we did was still about an issue. It was still about a vote. It still was about a track record, whether it be a financial history like in 35 or if it be a voting record. Every one of them was directly relatable to that. So we're a reflection of the activity that these candidates engage in. But who we pick speaks to your point, which is the people that we think are the more likely to engage in a meaningful and constructive and positive discussion in the broader sense once you get to the session. Now, is that going to create some ruffles as you actually move to governing? Yeah, of course it is. But that already exists. The question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And clearly, in this case, the egg came first in that, this debate is going on in the North Dakota legislature and in government in North Dakota and across the country right now. You have these extreme factions that have a voice, and certainly the internet, not just Rob, but the internet unto itself have given them a chance to expand that. But you have that going on in this country. And so what we do, I think, is not, and while we probably don't help it any, but we certainly don't create it. We reflect it in what we do.
Rob's going to get all defensive now.
Oh, no, Actually, I like that Pat had to clarify when he was referencing the role of the internet in North Dakota. He had to make it clear he wasn't just talking about me, which I kind of take as a compliment of sorts. I think Chad's point is well made. I think everybody, has a lot of thinking to do about our rhetoric and the way we talk, and whether that harms our ability to govern with people that maybe we don't like very much. I think that's one of the challenges of living in a democracy, is that the people you disagree with never go away. There are no permanent victories. There's always another election looming. And, I think we also, are my hands dirty? Yeah. You show me the person whose hands are clean on that front. So that's a tough one. We have just a few minutes left, Pat. What do you think this does primary day? And I think, there is still a general election coming that's going to move some of these chess pieces around a little bit. But what do you think of the power dynamic in the legislature now? Or the Bastiat, does that coalition have more power, less power? My feeling was it seems like it's maybe going to be about the same. But what are your thoughts?
Well, you got to get through the general. Right now, there will be, by my count and others I've talked to, about 35 new faces in the legislature. And now that's assuming some upsets, assuming some don't upset, on both sides of the aisle, right? So there'll be more to weigh out to get there. But do they have more influence? Yeah, I think there will be, especially if Donna Henderson beats Marv Nelson, they will have a net gain. You've got Dawson Hawley taking out Jim Schmidt. District 8, by the way, for the record, was a wash, right? That was already all Bastiat. But in 33, I don't think Keith Baines of Bastiat. I think you're going to have that's just one solid individual with another solid individual, I think is what's going to happen there. So in essence, I think there might be a slight gain in that. We'll know more come fall, but I certainly that then if there is, could affect leadership, because there's a huge vacuum in leadership right now with all the changes going on. That'll be the story to watch once we get through the general, is how does it play with the people that are positioned? Because 35 new legislators, whether they're Bastiat or not, really is going to create an environment where it could have unique and surprising outcomes. I do want to point out one thing. I'm not totally down on everybody that aligns with Bastiat. I think Matt Heilman is a serious young man and has some potential. Will he probably align with them and kind of vote that way initially? Yeah, but that doesn't mean he's like that forever. I actually think Dawson Hawley is young. And when I was 18, you got Hawley who's like 18 and Matt Heilman who's like 20. When I was that age, that was me, right? It's just that we were all about Reagan, not about Rick Becker in those days. But so, there are some really good, solid people who have the potential to be really solid, good legislators and future elected officials in that crowd. I think there are just some really good people in there that can make a difference. Obviously, with that, it's one of the reasons we opposed Sebastian Ertel. It's one of the reasons why, and got beat in District 8. But there are some of these young, idealistic people coming up. I think Cole Christensen is somebody who's a serious mind, who's not just grandstanding and voting no. So I think it's important to differentiate. It's not that this is all good, all bad. There are just some, like anywhere, there's some bad actors, but there are an awful lot of good. And some of the new faces, especially in this group of 35, I think there's some serious people in that will actually will make the dialogue and the legislative process even better.
We made that point in the first part I did, and I think Jim and Chad agreed that, there's some opportunity here to bring in, especially some of the newcomers, and say, listen, you have constituencies, you have real families, real businesses that live in your district that you're obliged to serve, and to try to serve well. And it can't just be about whatever was on the Fox News primetime that they're screaming and shouting about. It's got to be about real issues that matter to North Dakota. And sometimes that's going to be boring stuff like culverts, but it matters. So that's going to be interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Chad.
Rob, one last thing. I mean, Rayanne Kelsch gave a group of freshman legislators several cycles ago the advice: you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Use them proportionally in that same way. I think that's the key for some of these young folks coming in. Pat, I hope you're right about Heilman and Hawley and these other people, but the key is going to be if they get in there, they learn the process, they surround themselves with serious policymakers. That's how they'll make progress. It doesn't get you on the front page of the paper, but it's how you become an effective legislator. So I hope that's what they do.
I hope they get some good mentorship from some of the fine people that are already there.
Well, and you saw that happen in the past. You think about Wayne Stenjum and Jim Poolman and these people. They came in as wild-eyed conservatives, just like these guys, but they had good mentors. And I think you're right. That is a key to this. But there are a lot of people. I mean, I actually think Keith Bain's going to be a good legislator. I think he's going to be a good, solid, thinking individual. Every indication is he's a smart guy and has done very well in business.
Well, I hope you're right. I have my reservations about someone who wins an election on a single issue. An issue that really I don't think should be a priority for the state of North Dakota or for District 33 that has a lot of other challenges that they're facing right now. But
well, obviously, we were on Jessica's side in that battle, but
right.
That doesn't mean I think who won is
sure.
And that contrast with, I think there are some who got elected or who won that maybe aren't going to be the best in that deal, because they will be ideologues that follow a very narrow focus as opposed to growing in that role. But most of the 35 that are coming in, I think, have the potential to be really good legislators, and hopefully they get the mentorship from some of the other leadership.
Well, Pat, Chad, that's all the time we got. I certainly appreciate you coming on as always.
Thanks, Pat. Good to see you.
Good to see you guys, and have a great day. Thanks.
Want more political news like this? Visit inforum.news/port to get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Don't wait. Get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now.